What if the biggest wars in history were never about land or freedom, but about who profits from the destruction? What if the real victors of modern global conflict aren't generals or presidents, but bankers and financial institutions? Most people watch tanks move and missiles fire, but they never ask the question that matters most: who has already won? This is not a theory. It's documented history, erased and rewritten. This is the story you were never taught, the story of how global finance became the deadliest weapon of all. Welcome to Obscura Imperium. A different kind of war. Everyone is obsessed with the visible war, the front lines, territorial advances, tactical retreats, casualty counts. News feeds chase headlines like "Who will win?" or "When will it end?" But that view is a distraction. What if the outcome was determined long before the first shell was fired? What if the real battlefield is economic, not geographic? And what if the real war has already been won, not by armies, but by capital? This is not a narrative about tanks. This is a narrative about balance sheets. This is a story about power without uniforms. And it begins not in Ukraine, but with the collapse of the Soviet Union. The economic hitmen arrive, 1991. In 1991, as the Soviet Union disintegrated, a different sort of invasion began. It wasn't NATO troops crossing a border. It was Western economic policy advisors moving into ministries in Moscow. Their mission was labeled reform, but its effect was to engineer systemic collapse. Harvard-linked economists and Western financial institutions advocated shock therapy, a program of instantaneous liberalization of prices and the eradication of state control. Instead of a gradual transition, they demanded instant marketization, eliminating price controls, removing subsidies, and removing social safety nets all at once. What followed was not freedom, but chaos. Hyperinflation as a weapon. The result was hyperinflation, not a side effect, but an outcome baked into the policy. Prices skyrocketed, savings evaporated, pensions became worthless. Millions of ordinary citizens saw their life's work vaporize in months. The social contract between state and society was torn apart. This wasn't an unfortunate consequence, it was a strategy. By destroying the domestic economy, Western advisors paved the way for foreign capital to enter and acquire assets for pennies on the dollar. The people suffered, but the pipelines of value remained intact. The heist, loans for shares, 1995. With the population impoverished and state revenue depleted, the Russian government needed funds. Enter the Loans for Shares program, a scheme presented as a temporary financial fix, but engineered to transfer control of strategic industries to a small elite. Under this program, the state handed over shares in major oil, gas, and mining companies as collateral for loans. The auctions were opaque, sealed, and designed for insiders. Default was preordained. Within 18 months, roughly 60% of Russia's productive economy was in the hands of a handful of businessmen, later known as the oligarchs. Ownership changed, but sovereignty did not. Harvard's blood money. The Harvard Institute for International Development, one of the key architects of Russia's transition, had unique access to its institutions. Advisors not only shaped national policy, they also developed personal investment strategies based on insider knowledge. When this conflict of interest became public, the U.S. government sued Harvard, alleging that advisors used privileged information to make billions in personal profit. The scandal was settled quietly, and the narrative shifted to blaming Russian corruption. But the financial scoop remained. Western actors were not neutral advisors, they were profiteers. Creating the oligarch class. Western banks didn't just help engineer privatization, they trained and equipped those who would benefit from it. Goldman Sachs, Credit Suisse, Deutsche Bank, and others taught Russian elites how to conceal wealth, set up offshore structures, and leverage assets globally. They built a class loyal not to Russia, but to global capital flows. What Western financiers assumed they could control instead became a new power center. When Vladimir Putin rose to reassert state authority, he faced not just internal rivals, but a financially emboldened oligarchy with deep Western ties. The Vultures Circle, 1998 crash. By 1998, Russia defaulted on its debt. International hedge funds and banks that had bet against the ruble and Russian markets reaped massive profits. Remaining state assets were sold at rock-bottom prices, often to the same oligarchs, but under terms favorable to Western creditors. This was not collapse, this was a harvest. The patient was declared dead, so the vultures could feed. The target shifts. Ukraine, 2014. As Russia reasserted control internally, Western strategies pivoted. Ukraine became the next target for economic transformation. After the Maidan movement and the ousting of its president, Western policymakers installed a new finance minister, Natalie Jaresko, a U.S. citizen and former State Department official. Her task was not stabilization, but transformation. Austerity measures, privatization, and opening Ukraine's economy to foreign capital. The narrative was help, but the outcome was economic dependency. The Blood Machine, Lend-Lease 2.0. In 2022, the U.S. passed the Ukraine Democracy Defense Lend-Lease Act. While framed as military aid, Lend-Lease is a financing mechanism, a guarantee for a permanent flow of capital from U.S. Treasury to defense industries. War becomes a revenue stream. Long conflicts mean longer contracts, sustained production, extended debt. Peace would cut these flows, which is why the financiers don't just support war, they structure it. The pre-planned reconstruction. Even before the war stabilized, reconstruction deals were being signed. Major global financial players like BlackRock and J.P. Morgan are central to the Ukraine Development Fund, which positions them to own future infrastructure, utilities, and development rights. Through debt for equity swaps and long-term financing agreements, Ukraine's economic future becomes a source of profit for global capital. The destruction is the necessary phase before acquisition. Erasement of history. When historians write future textbooks, they will not explain these mechanisms. They will say, "We tried to help. They failed." They will attribute collapse to corruption or mismanagement. They will bury the systemic motives beneath moral judgments. But to admit that systemic failure was designed because it benefited powerful financial interests would expose the operating system of modern geopolitics. That is why this history is erased. Not conspiracy, but conscience. This narrative isn't about hatred. It isn't about geopolitics alone. It's about conscience and memory, about restoring the stories that were buried under profit motives and power plays. Every human community, every society deserves to know not just what happened, but why it happened and who benefited. This was only the beginning, not even 0.1% of what has been erased from official history. They rewrote the past to control the present,
But you were not meant to stay blind. Here, we don't just consume history, we decode it. You dig, you question, you remember. Subscribe to Obscura Imperium, because the invisible empire benefits from silence, and your curiosity is its threat.